I'm Patrick Brown, and this is Scripture versus Scripture. Today, we're going to do part four in our series on this book, The Decree of the King. Now, we have gotten to the point that we're going to talk about God the King, and we're going to illustrate that God is indeed the King who wrote a decree to his kingdom. And we're going to start off again talking about the qualifications of a king and how a king looks and see does God fit the bill. Although it should be no argument who the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords is, it may be some people out there who are naysayers, and we're going to put that to rest by showing that God more than qualifies as king. Let us begin. One of the most interesting personalities in the Bible is the king. A king is defined as someone who is sovereign, a male monarch who is superior in status or authority. The Bible chronicles a very extensive list of kings. A few of them are pagan, born outside of Abraham's lineage. Most are kings of Judah and Israel. This includes both the righteous and the wicked, the young and the old, the warlords and the peacemakers, and all the other adjectives that may apply. The king in the Old Testament Israel had to be anointed and recognized as ruler by his subordinates and the prophets. There are many things that made the position of the king the most cherished and respectful in the world. However, we will only focus on three of them: his position, his wealth, and his sovereignty. Now, we just said the king is one of the most respected positions that there were. The king of Israel had to be anointed. The king of Israel had to be in certain lineage. And also, the king of Israel was identified by three things in particular, which are his position, his wealth, and his sovereignty. Now, we're going to look at God and see does he qualify as king by his position, his wealth, and his sovereignty. Now, first of all, let's look at the position of the king. The position of the king had to be one that demanded reverence and respect. Wherever he went, he had to be recognized as the leader and sovereign of the land. Because of this, the king possessed several articles that were unique to his position. Now, these are things that, in general, kings around the world, not just the kings in Israel or Judah, the kings around the world possess. When you look at movies, TV shows, when you look at the history of kings, right? Not all kings possess each and every last one of the articles we're about to discuss, but in general, most kings had, majority of the three or the four of the list, or 4 or 5 of the list, these articles. Now, first, there was his crown. Obviously, this was the ultimate sign of leadership. Only one man could be crowned king, and most crowns were so elaborately decorated it was like wearing and walking with a treasure on your head. Next, there was his signet. This was usually a design which the king carried on a special ring. This signet was to use to seal any official document that the king had authorized. Again, only one man, the king, wore this special signet ring, and only through permission of the king was someone else dare to borrow and use it. Right? We're going to see in the Bible, whereas some people borrow, such as Haman, the king's signet ring, to sign or seal some documents, that the king had made a decree, and basically the king gave Haman permission to formulate a decree, and other people as well. But in order for the king to give his seal of approval, he had to give him the ring so that he could signify it. It's kind of like me going to my superior and say, "Hey, can I write a letter stating such, 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 or can I enact a policy that does such, 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 such?" And you tell the ruler what the policy is, and the king be like, "Yeah, yeah, I can agree with that." And so you write it, and I'll give you my ring. In other words, I'll give you my seal of approval. So the signet ring was basically the king's seal of approval, whether the king wrote it or someone else did. All right. Now, second to the crown, the next most recognized thing in a kingdom or in a position of authority, and you guessed it, all right, is the king's seat. The king's seat, and most likely we know this as a throne, right? The king had to sit in a place where people would know to come and to make requests of him. Anyone who came to petition the king would automatically know him, even if they had never seen him before. They would know him even if he did not wear his crown or his ring. The reason they would know him is because that he sat on the king's seat. The king's seat, normally called a throne, was usually located in a palace, where most were embroidered in expensive and beautiful dyes such as purple or scarlet. Talk about the throne here. In the case of scarlet, a certain type of worm had to be crushed in order to take his blood and make the dye. In addition to the color of the throne, it was usually covered with gold and precious stones. In short, the king's seat was the most magnificent in the kingdom. No one but the king sat on the throne. Right. So far, when we talk about kings, we talk about crowns, signet rings, and thrones. Hopefully, everybody out there in the audience can identify. Well, yeah, when I think of a king, I think about these elements. You might have never thought about these elements before that most kings possess, or a lot of kings possess, or that is universally recognized as being associated with a king. Okay. All right. So let's keep going. There are more. Then there was this scepter. This was simply a staff that was overlain with gold. Some also contain fine jewels as well. Most kings used this staff or scepter as a pointer. Only those given permission were allowed to approach the throne. Right? So, just like when Esther, in the book of Esther, would come and make requests of the king, she could not approach unless he pointed the scepter at her to give her permission to approach me. Otherwise, when you came to make requests of the king, if he sat there and did not point that scepter at you, you didn't approach the throne. Right? In addition to all this other hardware he carried and sat on, there was a group of men constantly around him. All right, now, yet a group of people surrounding the king, around the king. The chamberlains were simply high ranking officials that had access to the king's chamber. The Bible records that Ahasuerus, this was one of the kings, this is the king that we're going to talk about that was in the book of Esther. Esther is the book that we use as the founding principle or the founding book for the book that I written, The Decree of the King, because it's talking about the story of Esther. Again, I don't know what part that you have uh, found this channel on, and if you found this and you start in the middle of part 4, I do recommend that you go back and look at part 1, 2, and 3 and see the whole thing chronologically. Also, I definitely recommend that you read the book of Esther if you're not familiar with it. It's a good read and a blessing. All right. So next, the wise men were on standby at a moment's notice, and at that time consisted mostly of astrologers. These were men that the king used to help him with important decisions. All right, so far we got the chamberlains, high ranking officials, and we got the wise men, people to give him advice. Right, normally back at this time were astrologers. So these were the people that was in the king's chambers so far. When the king traveled, he was usually flanked by his armor bearer or some type of palace guard. Now, we got the armor bearer when he traveled, walked. His most common type of transportation would be a great white horse, a stallion. Right? When the king traveled, he usually was flanked by what? His armor bearer, and he traveled on a great white horse. Right? Again, like the throne, this elevated him to a height where the surrounding people could see him and identify him immediately because of his position of authority. When the king approached, whether he was sitting on, excuse me, when the king was approached, whether he was sitting on his throne, riding a horse, or just standing around the kingdom, the appropriate form of greeting would be to what? You guessed it, bow. Now, you should see a correlation in all these things. He's sitting up high on a throne, sitting up high when he traveled on a horse. Everybody's walking around him or on other horses, but not as magnificent as his stallion. Then, if he was walking, right? If he was walking, he had a crown on his head, which made his statue taller. And if he was walking without a crown, you approached him. Since the king himself could not make himself taller or any higher, you bowed yourself down to him and made yourself lower. You see that correlation here? There's a correlation between height and being a king, right? Let me read again. When the king approached, whether he was sitting on his throne, riding a horse, or just standing around in the kingdom, the appropriate form of greeting would be to bow. This lowers the person's head beneath the head of the king and shows submission to his position of authority. By now, I hope you have noticed the common theme in all of this. The king's position is symbolized by height. With the exception of the ring, most means of setting the king apart from everyone else made him taller than his subjects. His crown made him taller than normally would be, so did the strong and his horse. When he walked, it was impossible, when he walked, it was impossible that he could be any taller, but it was possible to make everyone around him who approached lower by bowing. These methods of submission are done by many different races and cultures around the world. Height and leadership go hand in hand, and it is a biblical principle started by God Himself. Think about this. Man has only imitated what God has established. The symbolism is clear. The king should be someone of integrity. We might say in our English language, someone we can look up to. Wow. This gets deep, y'all. This gets deep. The Bible is deep. Man has only imitated things God has already put in place and statute already. Right? So at any rate, the king was someone who was supposed to be noticed and respected. Okay? Now, a time for us to think. Does God qualify as king? Now, I'm going to get to this a little later. I want to jump ahead of all the things that God does and is to fulfill and live up to the billing as king. However, think about this. What do we call God? A lot of us, the Most High. What? The Most High. He's the Most High. Right? When we talk about God's throne or His position, He's up in heaven, above us. Right? Right? We don't talk about God being down below. We don't call God the most low. We call God the man. Let's keep going. All right, now that's position. Let's talk about the wealth of the king. All right. Hope this lesson is good to you. All right. I never read to my knowledge about a king who was broke. The position of the king was one that was filled with great wealth. I could go on and on about this king, that king, but it's better to cut to the chase and go straight to the wealthiest of them all, King Solomon. Let me talk about this money King Solomon had. Right now, King Solomon, already known to be the wisest man, also became the richest. He was so famous that people traveled from all over the world to hear him speak and marvel at his wealth. Even other rich rulers came to see if the rumors of King Solomon were true. Back in the days of Solomon, it was customary to bring gifts when visiting a king. Because of his wealth and stature, no ordinary gift was acceptable. Now, it seems kind of funny that the richest people get the best gifts. It's not like the poorest people get the best. If you're a celebrity today and you're rich and this, that, and the other, and you visit a club or you go to a restaurant, most likely they'll cater to you and give you a free meal, even though you can afford it. Or you say you go to the club, they let you in for free, even though you can afford it and stuff, and your drinks on the house and all that. Why? They just want you to be seen in their establishment, so you can draw other people there. Oh, this is where such and such eats. This is where such and such dines. This is where such and such likes to go. And then, so here you are, all this money rich, and what they do? Give you more free stuff. Give you more free stuff. All right. So same thing with the king. King Solomon already rich, and guess what? When people visit him, they gave him more stuff. Well, probably trying to impress him. Oh, I can give you, using illustration today of a person. I can give you a Rolls Royce. I can give you whatever. So, like, oh, okay, he give good gifts. This person is balling too. Well, I don't want to step on any toes of these mega churches that I like to criticize, of these institutional buildings. Anybody following this channel, understand? I believe in free church, simple church, house church, and because all the other stuff is not the way God has intended. Let me stick to the subject here. But the point is this: people gave the best gifts to the richest of people, and Solomon was no exception. All right. He was showered with spices and gold, gifts of rare jewels, perfumes, and whatsoever else that was thought to be precious that was bestowed upon him. In addition to gifts, in addition to his gifts, Solomon became wealthy by opposing one of the strict tax bases of his time. Solomon was indeed very rich. Solomon was beyond a billionaire in today's standards by the tally of gold that he had put upon him year by year, right? By the time of his death. We're going to talk about the sovereignty of the king. Now, sovereignty means, well, let's read. Sovereignty means to be superior in power or rank. Sovereignty means to be supreme in power or rank. Some people try to compare the modern day president to that of the biblical king when there is simply no comparison. The president and the king, now this is the decree of the king, not the decree of the president. Why? Because God is king, Lord of Lords, King of Kings. He is king of kings. We got king. He king of them. All right. Why? He ain't president. I'm gonna tell you the difference. The king of biblical days was often judge, jury, and executioner. The king made the laws of the land that were not subject to debate by any house, senate, or jury. King didn't have to check in with nobody. He didn't have to write a bill and then have it passed through Congress. No, he said it is executed. Throw them in the lion's den. In the lion's den you go. Right? So, much like the president of today, however, he did have a staff of advisors. These wise men were experts in various fields and were used to aid the king in making decisions. This was an important position because, as we have already seen, once a king made a decision and made a decree, it was no taking it back. If the president of the United States decided he wanted everyone to stop praying for 30 days under penalty of death, his bill would not pass through the powers that be ever to become law. And even if it did, it would go through so much political red tape that it would take more than 30 days to ever pass it. Not only Not only would such a law fail politically, judicially it will violate both freedom of religion and freedom of speech as stated in the United States Constitution. The President of the United States can't pass a bill and say, I don't want nobody praying to anyone else but me for 30 days, and it ever come to fruition. Come on now. The President don't have that power. However, as we have already seen in chapter 6 of the book of Daniel, King Darius not only had the power to tell people who to petition or pray to, he had the power to implement punishment. The president could never walk up to someone and order the entire family to be put in the electric chair and have it come to pass. King Darius threw all of Daniel's accusers along with their families in the lion's den, and no one said a mumbling word. And even if they did mumble, it was so very softly because Darius had the power to make them and their families next on the menu. King, why you do that? You too. See, no, I want you to get an understanding of what we're talking about here. We ain't talking about a king. We ain't talking about a governor, a senator, a president, a judge. We talking about a king. God is king. All right. In summary, where the president sits in the position of most authority, the kings of that era sat in a position of all authority. In fact, some kings of the past were considered divinity. Many Egyptian pharaohs were worshipped, such as was the case with the pharaoh who Moses petitioned. When Moses told him to let the people go, his arrogance and disdain for the Lord can be seen in his statement, "Who is the Lord that I should obey him?" He's like, "Ooh, I'm a God. I'm Pharaoh. I'm a God. Who's the Lord that I, a God in his mind, should obey him?" That's basically what Pharaoh was saying. Right. One of the best examples of the king's sovereignty can be found in the third chapter of Daniel. After King Nebuchadnezzar set up a golden image, he wanted everyone to assemble around and worship it. Let's read in Daniel chapter 3 and see what's going on here in this portion of scripture. Daniel 3, verse 3. Then the princes, the governors and captains, the judges, the treasurers, the counselors, the sheriffs, and all the rulers of the provinces were gathered together unto the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Verse 4. Then a herald cried aloud, "To you it is commanded, O people, nations, and languages, that at the time ye hear the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, dulcimer, and all kinds of music, you fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. And whosoever fall not down and worship shall the same hour be cast into the midst of a burning fiery furnace." In other words, you fall down to this idol or get thrown in a fiery furnace and burnt up. That was the options that the king had set up. And the king had the power and authority to make it happen. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego remained faithful to the one true God and refused to worship the golden image. These three Hebrew boys said, "No, not so. I only worship one God." The king was so enraged, he commanded that they heat the furnace hotter than normal and cast the three men in at once. Now, they were Hebrew boys, but they had grown up. Now, let's read the conclusion of the matter in verse 19. Then was Nebuchadnezzar full of fury, and the form of his visage was changed. His countenance, his whole attitude was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Therefore he spake and commanded that they should heat the furnace 7 times more than it was wont to be heated. And he commanded the most mighty men that were in his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and cast them into the burning, fiery furnace. Then these men were bound in their coats, their hosen, and their hats, and the other garments, and were cast into the midst of the burning, fiery furnace. Now, we all know that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out alive because they was worshiping, you guessed it, the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, and they did not violate his decree or his commands. The king who they violated was the king, Nebuchadnezzar commands. That's going back to what we said about the king in heaven, our Lord. He is the King of Kings. He is the ruler of kings. He is sovereign of kings. Nebuchadnezzar was king. He gave a command. They violated it because they had a command from a higher source, the king of the king. Okay? They understood that. I hope the listener of this message today understands that. You have a king of kings, a king of president, a king of governors, a king of all other authorities. That is who you follow directions from. All right? Now, when many people read the third chapter of Daniel, they focus on the miraculous delivery of God's servants. This is a standard example of God's ability to save under any circumstance. However, there's something else even more miraculous happening within these verses. Sadly enough, a lot of people overlook it. What do you find peculiar? All of the strong men that brought Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to the furnace perished. I can imagine as they escorted or carried the bound governors to the heart of the furnace that their feet blistered and their blood began to boil. I could see them wincing in agony every step of the way as they cooked alive in the flames. Amazingly, they pressed on until their bodies were overwhelmed by the heat. Why is this so important? Or I wanted to make a point of this, something for you to notice. What made these men keep walking in heat, perishing? The answer? Why would a man knowingly walk into his destruction? Why would someone obediently follow a command that included pain and suffering, knowing the end result was death? The answer is simple: the sovereignty of the king. If a human king is that sovereign, oh my goodness. If a human king is that sovereign that these people pressed on in the heat and perished, what about the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords? Shouldn't we be as obedient to his decree, his word, his commands? Shouldn't overshadow that of a mortal man? Come on now. You know the answer to that. The answer is yes. Our King. Let's talk about our King. I'm go ahead and say that for the next part. Now that we talked about uh, all these attributes of the King, we're going to go back and conclude by showing how God fits the bill of all these attributes. Again, does he fit the bill in position, wealth, and authority? Is God truly the King of Kings? Hope you enjoyed that lesson. We will conclude in part 5. Talk to you later.